Tears stained Theresa Adams' cheeks as she stood alone on the dusty platform of Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1878, clutching her single valise while cruel laughter echoed around her. The train that had carried her over 1,000 miles from Boston had departed, leaving behind nothing but coal smoke and the crushing reality that the man who had promised to make her his bride was nowhere to be found, and worse, had apparently arranged this public humiliation. Well, if it ain't Mr. Gardner's fancy Eastern bride," a red-faced man called out, his voice thick with mockery as he approached from the small crowd gathered at the depot. "Bet you thought you were coming to a mansion with servants, didn't you, Miss Frills and Lace?" Theresa's throat tightened as she tried to maintain her composure. At 22, she had left everything behind: her position as a schoolteacher, her tiny rented room, the few friends she had, all for the promise of marriage to a man who had written such beautiful letters describing his prosperous ranch and longing for a proper wife. "I'm looking for Mr. Leonard Gardner," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "We've been corresponding for 6 months, and he was to meet me today." The announcement only brought more laughter from the small gathering of townsfolk. "Gardner," the man hooted. "That scoundrel ain't had 2 pennies to rub together since his daddy died. He's been bragging all over town about how he tricked some fancy Eastern lady into paying her own way west. Said he'd be long gone before you ever arrived, headed to California with your travel money he convinced you to send ahead." Fresh tears welled in Theresa's eyes as the humiliation burned through her. Around her, several women whispered behind gloved hands while men openly guffawed. Her entire savings gone, her reputation in tatters, her future suddenly as barren as the desert landscape surrounding this dusty frontier town. "Ain't you a pretty picture of disappointment?" another voice called out. "Gardner said you claimed to be young and beautiful. Looks like you only told half-truths yourself." Theresa's head dropped lower, her bonnet hiding her face as she clutched her valise tighter. Everything she owned in the world was in that small bag: a few dresses, her mother's Bible, and barely $15 to her name. Not enough for a return ticket, not enough for anything. That's quite enough. The deep voice cut through the jeering like a knife. The crowd parted as a tall man strode forward, his spurs jingling with each determined step. Theresa didn't look up, couldn't bear another face of mockery. Rough, calloused fingers gently touched her chin, lifting her face upward until she was looking into the most startlingly kind blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a man perhaps 30 years old, his face weathered by sun and wind, a faint scar running along his jaw beneath several days of stubble. His dark hat shaded most of his features, but she could see the quiet fury in his expression, not directed at her, but at the crowd around them. "You're worth more than all this," he said quietly, just for her ears. Then he turned to face the gathered onlookers, his hand falling protectively to her elbow. "Any man who finds amusement in a lady's suffering isn't worth the dirt under my horse's hooves. Show's over. Go on about your business." There was something in his stance and the quiet authority of his voice that made the crowd shift uncomfortably. One by one, they began to disperse, the red-faced ringleader being the last to slink away after meeting the newcomer's steely gaze. When they were relatively alone on the platform, he turned back to Theresa. "The name's Russell Garrett," he said, removing his hat briefly in a gesture of respect. "I've got a small spread about 5 miles outside of town. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, has a room above the kitchen she'd be happy to let you use until you sort things out." Theresa stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate gratitude. "Why would you help me, Mr. Garrett? You don't know me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My mother came west as a mail-order bride 30 years ago. She was lucky my father was as honest as the day is long, but she always taught me that a true man protects those who need protecting." He paused. "No strings attached, miss. Just a safe place to stay while you decide what to do next." Theresa looked around the now empty platform at the unfamiliar town stretching before her and realized she had no other options. With as much dignity as she could muster, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I would be grateful for your assistance." Russell took her valise with one hand and offered his other arm for support. "My wagon's this way. Welcome to Las Cruces, Miss Adams. I promise you not everyone here is cut from the same cloth as Leonard Gardner." As they walked away from the depot, Theresa couldn't know that this moment of kindness would be the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined, a story that would unfold across the wild landscape of New Mexico territory, testing both their hearts and their courage in ways the genteel society of Boston could never have prepared her for. The ride to Russell Garrett's ranch was mostly silent. Theresa sat rigidly on the wagon seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, too emotionally drained to make conversation. Russell seemed to understand, focusing on driving his team of 2 sturdy horses along the dusty road that wound through scrubland dotted with mesquite and yucca plants. As they traveled, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, mountains rose purple against the vast blue sky. It was beautiful in an alien way, so different from the manicured gardens and crowded streets of Boston that Theresa felt as though she'd traveled to another world entirely. "That's the Organ Mountains," Russell said, breaking the silence as he nodded toward the jagged peaks. "They say they're named that way because they look like the pipes of a church organ." Theresa glanced at him, then at the mountains. "I can see the resemblance," she replied softly. "My ranch sits in their shadow. Good water supply from the mountain streams." He paused. "It's not much compared to what you might be used to, but it's honest land." She turned to look at him fully now. "Mr. Garrett, I wasn't raised with silver spoons. I was a schoolteacher in Boston, living in a boarding house. My parents died of influenza 5 years ago, leaving me with little but my education." Her voice grew softer. "Leonard Mr. Gardner wrote that he had a prosperous cattle ranch with a fine house. I believed him because I wanted to believe him." Russell's expression softened. "We all want to believe in something better, Miss Adams." He glanced at her with those piercing blue eyes. "And please call me Russell. Out here, formality doesn't last long." "Then you must call me Theresa," she replied, surprising herself with the offer. They crested a small hill, and Russell's ranch came into view in the valley below. A modest but well-maintained single-story house sat at the center of the property, smoke curling from its chimney. Several outbuildings, a barn, what appeared to be a bunkhouse, and various sheds were arranged around it. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, Theresa could see cattle grazing on the grassland that stretched toward the mountains. It wasn't the grand estate Leonard Gardner had described in his letters, but there was something undeniably appealing about its honest simplicity. "Circle G Ranch," Russell announced. "Started it with my father 15 years ago. He passed on 3 years back, but I've managed to keep it going. Even added another 100 acres last year." As they approached, a stout woman with iron-gray hair emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. 2 ranch hands appeared from the direction of the barn, watching curiously as the wagon rolled to a stop. "Mrs. Winters," Russell called as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "We have a guest who will be staying with us for a while." The older woman's eyebrows rose as she took in Theresa's city clothes and obvious distress. Russell moved to help Theresa down, his strong hands encircling her waist briefly before setting her gently on the ground. "This is Miss Theresa Adams," Russell explained to his housekeeper. "She's had a difficult journey." Leonard Gardner arranged for her to come as his bride, then absconded with her money and left her stranded at the depot. Mrs. Winter's face darkened. That good-for-nothing snake always knew he was trouble. She immediately softened her expression as she turned to Theresa. "You poor dear. Come inside and let me fix you something to eat. You look ready to collapse." Theresa felt a wave of gratitude at the woman's kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. I don't wish to be a burden." "Nonsense," the housekeeper interrupted, taking Theresa's arm. "Any decent person would do the same. Besides, it'll be nice having another woman around this place. Too many men and not enough civilizing influence, that's what I always say." Russell handed Theresa's valise to one of the ranch hands. "Jake, take this up to the room above the kitchen, would you?" To Theresa he added, "It's small, but it's clean and private. Mrs. Winters used it before we built her a proper bedroom in the main house." "It sounds perfect," Theresa said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness, as Mrs. Winters led her toward the house. Theresa couldn't help glancing back at Russell. He stood watching them go, his hat in his hands and an unreadable expression on his face. When their eyes met, he gave her a slight nod before turning to speak to his men. Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished. Handmade wooden furniture, colorful woven rugs, and a few modest decorations gave it a homey feel that immediately put Theresa more at ease. "The boss is a good man," Mrs. Winters said as she bustled around the kitchen, putting a kettle on the stove and slicing bread from a fresh loaf. "Works harder than any 3 men I know. Never thought I'd end up keeping house for a bachelor rancher at my age, but after my Albert died, Mr. Garrett offered me this position." She smiled fondly. "Said he couldn't boil water without burning it and needed someone to make sure he didn't starve to death." Theresa found herself smiling for the first time that day. "He seems very kind." "Kind, yes, but no pushover. You should see him when dealing with cattle rustlers or cheating merchants." Mrs. Winters placed a cup of tea and a plate of bread with butter and honey in front of Theresa. "Now eat something. You look like a strong wind might blow you away." As Theresa gratefully accepted the simple meal, Mrs. Winters continued talking, filling her in on life at the Circle G Ranch. There were 4 permanent ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, plus additional seasonal workers during busier times. The ranch primarily raised cattle but also had horses, chickens, and a small vegetable garden that Mrs. Winters tended herself. "What will you do now, dear?" the housekeeper asked gently after Theresa had eaten. "Do you have family back east you could return to?" Theresa shook her head. "No family, and I spent nearly everything I had on the train ticket. Mr. Gardner convinced me to send ahead the rest for," she faltered, embarrassment coloring her cheeks, "for wedding preparations." Mrs. Winters made a disgusted sound. "That man should be horsewhipped." "Well, you're welcome here as long as you need, isn't that right, Mr. Garrett?" Theresa turned to find Russell standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. She hadn't heard him enter. "Of course," he said. "No rush, Miss Adams. Las Cruces isn't Boston, but it's growing. There might be opportunities for someone with your education." Theresa nodded, grateful but uncertain. "I'll need to find work soon. Perhaps the town needs a teacher." Russell's expression brightened. "As a matter of fact, I believe they do. The last schoolmaster left about a month ago, something about the climate not agreeing with him." He hesitated. "I'm riding into town tomorrow. If you'd like to come along, I could introduce you to Mayor Hollister." Hope flickered inside Theresa for the first time since arriving in New Mexico. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Garrett Russell." A small smile touched his lips at her use of his first name. Then it settled. "Now you should rest. It's been a long day." Mrs. Winters showed Theresa to her room above the kitchen. It was indeed small but clean and cozy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the ranch toward the mountains. After the housekeeper left, Theresa sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to fully process the day's events. The bitter sting of Leonard Gardner's betrayal, the public humiliation at the depot, the unexpected kindness of a stranger with blue eyes and a quiet voice who had simply said, "You're worth more." As the sun set over the Oregon mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Theresa Adams unpacked her few belongings and realized that while this wasn't the life she had traveled west to find, perhaps it was the beginning of something unexpected, something that might, in time, heal the wounds of betrayal and lead to a future she couldn't yet imagine. Morning came early at the Circle G ranch. Theresa woke to the sounds of activity in the kitchen below, pots clanging, Mrs. Winters humming, the scrape of chairs on the wooden floor as the ranch hands came in for breakfast. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a modest navy blue garment with white collar and cuffs, and pinned her brown hair into a simple but neat arrangement. If she was to apply for a teaching position, she wanted to look respectable, despite her circumstances. When she descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen, the conversation among the ranch hands faltered momentarily before resuming with more subdued tones. Mrs. Winters gave her a warm smile and immediately set a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before her. "Eat up, dear. Russell says you'll be heading into town within the hour." Theresa nodded her thanks and took a seat at the far end of the table, conscious of the curious glances from the men. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, tipped his hat to her. "Name's Charlie, madam. Been with the Circle G since Mr. Garrett's father started it. Just wanted to say we're all mighty sorry about what happened to you yesterday." Theresa felt her cheeks warm. Word travels fast, it seems. Small communities don't keep many secrets. Another ranch hand, Jake, she recalled, added with a shrug. Gardner's been nothing but trouble since he got his hands on his daddy's land and promptly lost most of it to gambling and bad investments. Charlie nodded. "Boss told us you might be applying for the teaching position in town. My nephew's one of the school-age kids there. They need someone with proper learning to teach them." Before Theresa could respond, Russell entered the kitchen, and once again the atmosphere shifted subtly. The men straightened in their seats, their manner becoming more respectful without being servile. It spoke volumes about the type of employer Russell was: firm but fair, commanding respect without demanding it. "Morning, Miss Adams," Russell said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," she replied. "And please remember it's Theresa." A brief smile touched his lips as he nodded. "We'll head out once you've finished breakfast. Mayor Hollister is usually at his office by 9. Russell excused himself to attend to some business before their departure, and Theresa finished her meal, oddly comforted by the routine domesticity of the ranch kitchen. Mrs. Winters packed them a small lunch for the journey, and by 8 o'clock, Theresa found herself once again seated beside Russell in his wagon, heading toward Las Cruces. The morning was clear and cool, the air carrying the scent of sage and desert flowers. Russell pointed out landmarks along the way: a natural spring where travelers often stopped, an ancient cottonwood tree that served as a meeting point for the local ranchers, the distant silver ribbon of the Rio Grande winding through the valley. "You know the area well," Theresa observed. Russell nodded. "Been here since I was 15. My father moved us from Missouri after my mother died, said we both needed a fresh start." His voice grew softer. He was right. Something about this land, it has a way of healing broken things. There was such quiet conviction in his words that Theresa found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the slight crease between his brows, the way the morning light caught in his dark hair where it curled at his collar. He wasn't classically handsome like some of the polished gentlemen in Boston, but there was something compelling about his features, a strength and honesty that she found herself drawn to. "What made you become a rancher?" she asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question. "I like the work. It's hard but honest. At the end of the day, you can see what you've accomplished." He glanced at her. "Not so different from teaching, I'd imagine. You shape young minds like I shape this land." His comparison surprised her. "I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. There's great satisfaction in seeing a child grasp a difficult concept or develop a love of learning." Their conversation flowed more easily after that. Theresa told him about her years teaching in Boston, and he shared stories of ranch life, some humorous, some harrowing. By the time they reached the outskirts of Las Cruces, Theresa realized she felt more at ease with this man she'd known for barely a day than she had with Leonard Gardner after months of correspondence. Las Cruces looked different in the morning light, less intimidating than it had seemed the previous afternoon. The main street was lined with a mix of adobe and wooden buildings. People moved about their business, and wagons rumbled past loaded with goods. Russell pointed out the key establishments as they drove: the general store, the bank, the small church, and finally, the schoolhouse. It was a modest single-room building with several windows and a small bell tower. Currently empty for the summer months, it stood waiting for students to return in the fall. "What do you think?" Russell asked, noting her intent examination of the building. "It's smaller than I'm used to, but it has good light," she replied practically. "How many children attend?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 16. Some of the ranch and farm children can only come seasonally, when they're not needed for work." Theresa nodded. It was a common arrangement in rural areas. "And the teaching materials, basic from what I understand. Books are hard to come by out here, though the last teacher left his collection." They continued to the mayor's office, located in a solid brick building that also housed the town's small government. Mayor Hollister proved to be a portly, enthusiastic man in his 50s with an impressive mustache and a booming voice. "A teacher from Boston. Well, this is providential timing," he exclaimed after Russell had introduced Theresa and explained her situation, tactfully omitting the more humiliating details of Gardner's deception. "We've been without proper instruction for our children since Professor Jenkins departed. His lungs couldn't handle our dust, poor fellow." Theresa presented her credentials thankfully. She had brought her teaching certificates with her and answered the mayor's questions about her experience and educational philosophy. Within half an hour, Mayor Hollister was offering her the position. "The pay is $30 a month with lodging in the small house behind the schoolhouse," he explained. "Term starts in 3 weeks. That should give you time to settle in and prepare." Theresa's heart lifted at the prospect of employment and independence. "Thank you, Mayor Hollister. I accept your offer and will do my best for the children of Las Cruces." After completing the necessary paperwork, Russell suggested they walk through town so Theresa could familiarize herself with it. He introduced her to several shopkeepers and residents, most of whom were welcoming once they learned she was to be the new schoolteacher. A few women who had been at the depot the previous day looked embarrassed upon seeing her but offered tentative smiles. At the general store, the proprietor, a kindly older man named Mr. Peterson, insisted on showing Theresa his selection of school supplies. Ordered them for Professor Jenkins, but he left before using most of them. Slates, chalk, primers, all waiting for the next teacher. He beamed at her. "That would be you, Miss Adams." As they were leaving the store, a tall, expensively dressed man entered, nearly colliding with them. His eyes widened in recognition upon seeing Theresa. "Well, well. If it isn't Gardner's mail-order mistake," he drawled, his voice carrying enough to make heads turn in the store. "Already latched onto another provider, I see." His gaze flicked dismissively over Russell. Theresa felt her face flame with humiliation, but before she could respond, Russell stepped slightly forward, his posture deceptively casual but his eyes hard as flint. "Mr. Donovan," Russell acknowledged coolly. "Miss Adams is Las Cruces' new schoolteacher. I'm sure as a town council member you'll want to make her feel welcome." The man Donovan narrowed his eyes. "Garrett, still playing the white knight. Some might question your motives for taking in a stranded woman." Russell's expression didn't change, but Theresa noticed his hands tighten briefly at his sides. Some might do better minding their own business, especially those with reputations as fragile as glass houses. The implied threat hung in the air. Around them, the store had gone quiet, customers pretending to examine goods while listening intently. Donovan's jaw worked for a moment before he forced a cold smile. "Welcome to Las Cruces, Miss Adams. I'm sure you'll find it educational." With a mocking tip of his hat, he moved past them into the store. Outside, Theresa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Who was that charming individual? Russell's expression was grim. "Victor Donovan. Owns the largest ranch bordering mine." He and Gardner were close birds of a feather in more ways than one. "He's been trying to buy my water rights for years." His face softened as he looked at her. "Don't let him bother you. His opinion isn't worth the breath it takes to express it." Theresa nodded, though the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "I'll develop a thicker skin. I imagine I'll need one as the new teacher in town." They continued their tour, ending at the small house behind the schoolhouse that would be Theresa's new home. It was a simple 2-room adobe structure with basic furniture: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small cookstove, and a bookshelf. A water pump stood just outside the back door, and a privy was discreetly located behind a screen of mesquite. "It's perfectly adequate," Theresa said, genuinely pleased with the modest accommodation. After the boarding house in Boston, this small place felt like a palace. It would be all hers. Russell looked around critically. "Roof needs some patching before the summer rains. And that door doesn't hang quite right." He met her gaze. "If you'd like, I could send Jake and Charlie to make repairs before you move in." "That would be very kind," she replied, "though I don't want to impose further on your generosity." He shook his head. "It's no imposition. Neighbors help each other out here. It's the Western way." As they headed back to the wagon for the return journey, Theresa felt a curious mix of emotions. Relief at securing a position so quickly, pride in her independence, and something else: a growing awareness of the man beside her, his quiet strength and unexpected thoughtfulness. When they reached the wagon, Russell helped her up to the seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For just a moment after she was seated, he remained standing beside the wagon, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You did well today," he said simply. "Most people who have been through what you have would still be licking their wounds." Theresa smiled faintly. "My father always said Adams women were made of stern stuff. Besides, wallowing won't put food on the table or a roof over my head." Russell nodded, a glint of approval in his blue eyes. "No, it won't." He circled the wagon and climbed up beside her, ready to head back to the ranch. As they drove away from Las Cruces, Theresa realized that for the first time since arriving in New Mexico, she was looking forward rather than back. The pain of Leonard Gardner's betrayal was still there, but it had been overshadowed by new possibilities: a teaching position, a home of her own, and perhaps even the beginnings of friendship with the quiet rancher who had come to her rescue when she needed it most. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Theresa divided her time between helping Mrs. Winters at the ranch, insisting on earning her keep despite the older woman's protests, and preparing for the start of the school term. True to his word, Russell sent his men to repair her future home, and he himself rode into town with her several times to help transport books and supplies from the general store to the schoolhouse. During these journeys, Theresa learned more about Russell Garrett. He was 31, had never married, and was respected throughout the county for his fair dealings and hard work. His Circle G ranch wasn't the largest in the area, but it was prosperous and well managed. He employed local men, paid fair wages, and was known for helping neighbors during difficult times. The drought 2 years ago nearly wiped out several small ranches, Mrs. Winters told Theresa one evening as they prepared dinner. Mr. Garrett allowed 3 families to graze their cattle on his land where the water still flowed, saved their livelihoods. Such stories, combined with Theresa's own observations, painted a picture of a man with a strong moral compass and a genuine concern for others' qualities that had become increasingly rare in the competitive business environment of post-Civil War America. As for Theresa, she found herself adapting to ranch life more easily than she would have expected. She learned to identify the different plants that grew in the garden and the wild herbs Mrs. Winters used in her cooking. She became familiar with the rhythms of the ranch: the early morning bustle, the midday quiet when the sun beat down too fiercely for outdoor work, the evening gatherings on the porch when the day's heat began to dissipate. She also met more of the local residents as word spread about the new schoolteacher. Mothers brought their children to meet her, expressing relief that the school would reopen. Several of the town's more prominent women invited her to join their sewing circle. Even the local newspaper editor interviewed her for a small piece announcing her appointment. Not everyone was welcoming. Victor Donovan made a point of ignoring her completely when they crossed paths in town. A few women, clearly friends of Leonard Gardner, whispered behind their hands when she passed. But these were minor shadows in what was otherwise becoming a surprisingly positive experience. 5 days before school was to begin, Russell found Theresa sitting on the porch after dinner, a pile of papers in her lap as she reviewed her lesson plans by the last light of day. "May I join you?" he asked, holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled and moved her papers aside. "Of course." He handed her one of the cups and settled into the chair beside her, stretching his long legs out before him. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in deepening shades of purple and gold. "I've been meaning to ask," Russell finally said, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. "Will you be comfortable living alone in town? It's generally safe, but still." Theresa appreciated his concern without finding it condescending, as she might have from another man. "I believe so. Mayor Hollister mentioned that the sheriff makes regular rounds past the schoolhouse, and Mrs. Peterson from the general store has already offered to check on me regularly." She smiled faintly. "Besides, I lived alone in Boston after my parents died. I'm quite accustomed to independence." Russell nodded, though something like concern lingered in his expression. "It's different here, more isolated." He hesitated. "If you ever feel unsafe or need anything, day or night, send word to the ranch. I can be in town within an hour." The sincerity in his voice touched her. "Thank you, Russell. That means a great deal." He looked away, seemingly embarrassed by his own earnestness. "Jake and Charlie finished the last of the repairs today. Your house is ready whenever you want to move in." Theresa felt a curious mix of emotions at this news: excitement about beginning her new life, yet an unexpected reluctance to leave the ranch. In just 3 weeks, it had begun to feel like home in a way her boarding house in Boston never had. "I should probably move in tomorrow or the next day," she said practically. "That will give me time to settle before school starts." Russell nodded, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "I'll drive you in. Mrs. Winters is putting together some supplies for your pantry: flour, sugar, coffee, preserves. Says a teacher needs proper nourishment to keep up with 20 children." Theresa laughed softly. "She's very kind. You all have been." She turned to look at him directly. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Russell. When I arrived here, I was at my lowest point. You not only offered me shelter but helped me find a new path forward." In the fading light, she couldn't quite read his expression, but she thought she saw his eyes soften. "You don't owe me thanks," he said simply. "You've earned your place here through your own strength and determination." He paused. "Besides, Mrs. Winters has enjoyed having another woman around. She's been telling me for years I need to find a wife just so she'd have female company." There was humor in his tone, but something else too, a note that made Theresa's heart beat a little faster. Before she could respond, however, one of the ranch hands called for Russell from the direction of the barn. "Excuse me," he said, rising. "Sounds like that new mare might be having trouble with her foaling." Theresa watched him stride away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the gathering darkness. She remained on the porch long after he'd gone, her coffee cooling forgotten in her hands, her mind filled with thoughts of the man who had become so unexpectedly important in her life. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Theresa prepared to move to her new home in Las Cruces. Mrs. Winters packed enough food to feed an army, according to Russell, who watched with amusement as the housekeeper filled a large basket with bread, cheese, dried meats, preserves, and a still warm apple pie. "You'll be back for Sunday dinner," Mrs. Winters instructed Theresa firmly. "No arguments. The boss always brings the men in for a proper meal after church, and you'll join us." Theresa smiled, touched by the invitation. "I would like that very much." Her few belongings were quickly loaded into Russell's wagon, along with several books the ranch hands had found in the attic, educational material. Charlie had explained with a wink, and a small rocking chair that Mrs. Winters insisted would be perfect for grading papers in the evening. The journey to Las Cruces was quiet, both Theresa and Russell seemingly lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at her small adobe house, Russell efficiently unloaded her possessions while Theresa arranged her new home, placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table and setting the rocking chair near the window where the light was best. "It's coming together nicely," Russell observed as he brought in the last of her things. Theresa looked around the simple space that was now hers. "Yes, it is." There was an awkward moment when everything was settled, a sense that something important remained unsaid between them. Russell stood near the door, hat in his hands, his usual composure slightly disturbed. "Well," he finally said, "I should let you get settled. Remember, Sunday dinner at the ranch." Theresa nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "I'll be there." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Theresa," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "I'm glad you came to Las Cruces, despite the circumstances that brought you here." Before she could respond, he was gone, the sound of his wagon fading as he drove away. Theresa stood in the doorway of her new home, watching until he disappeared from sight, a curious ache in her heart that she wasn't quite ready to examine. The next few days were consumed with final preparations for school. Theresa organized the classroom, arranged books on shelves, and wrote out lesson plans for each age group. Several parents brought their children to meet her, and she began the process of assessing their previous education to determine where each student should begin. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Theresa wore her best dress, a forest green gown with modest lace at the collar, and walked to the small church in the center of town. The service was well attended, with most of Las Cruces residents present. Theresa sat near the back, still feeling somewhat like an outsider despite the friendly nods and smiles she received. Just as the minister was about to begin, the door opened, and Russell entered with his ranch hands. He spotted Theresa immediately, and to her surprise, made his way to her pew, sliding in beside her with a quiet nod of greeting. His clean-shaven face and carefully combed hair spoke of special effort for the church service, and the faint scent of soap and leather that accompanied him was not unpleasant. Throughout the service, Theresa was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers, the deep resonance of his voice joining in the hymns. When the collection plate was passed, he contributed generously, though she knew from Mrs. Winters that the ranch's profits were modest. After the service, they walked together to his wagon for the journey back to Circle G Ranch. Several townspeople watched with undisguised interest, and Theresa heard whispers that made her cheeks warm. "Pay them no mind," Russell said quietly as he helped her up to the wagon seat. "Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal." The Sunday dinner at the ranch was a lively affair. Mrs. Winters had outdone herself with a roast, vegetables from her garden, fresh bread, and a berry cobbler for dessert. The ranch hands, cleaned up for the occasion, shared stories and jokes, treating Theresa with a respectful warmth that made her feel included in their close-knit group. After the meal, while the men relaxed on the porch, Russell asked if Theresa would like to see more of the ranch. "I've been so busy getting the house and classroom ready that I haven't had a chance to explore," she admitted. "Then you should see it now before school keeps you too occupied," he suggested. "I could saddle a gentle mare for you if you ride." Theresa hesitated. "It's been many years since I was on horseback. My father taught me as a girl, but in Boston, there was little opportunity." Russell smiled. "It's like reading once learned, never forgotten. But if you prefer, we could take the buggy instead." The smaller, open buggy proved a good compromise. Russell drove them along the boundaries of his property, pointing out landmarks and explaining the workings of the ranch. They stopped at a small rise overlooking a meadow where cattle grazed peacefully beside a clear stream. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Russell said as he helped Theresa from the buggy. "My father and I would come here to talk through important decisions." He glanced at her. "I still do, in a way." Theresa understood. "You feel his presence here." Russell nodded, seemingly pleased that she comprehended without further explanation. They stood side by side, watching the play of sunlight on the water. "School starts tomorrow," Russell observed after a comfortable silence. "Yes," Theresa replied. "I'm nervous and excited in equal measure." "You'll do well," he said with quiet confidence. "Those children are fortunate to have you as their teacher." His faith in her abilities warmed Theresa more than she would have expected. "Thank you. That means a great deal, coming from you." Russell turned to face her fully then, his blue eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "Theresa," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I know you came to New Mexico with certain expectations that were cruelly dashed. I know your trust has been damaged by Gardner's deception." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that not all men out here are like him. Some of us still value honesty and honor above all else." Theresa felt a tightness in her throat at the sincerity in his voice. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said softly. Something shifted in Russell's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. For a moment she thought he might say more, might even reach for her hand. But the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Jake rode toward them, his horse at a canter. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble. Victor Donovan's men are claiming we've got some of their cattle mixed in with ours in the north pasture. They're threatening to cut the fence and drive them out themselves." Russell's expression immediately hardened. "Take Miss Adams back to the house," he instructed Jake. "Then round up Charlie and the others. I'll meet you at the north boundary." Before Theresa could say anything, Russell was striding toward his horse, which was tethered nearby. He mounted in one fluid motion, then paused, looking back at her with regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Winters will make sure you get back to town safely." With that, he was gone, riding hard in the direction of the north pasture. Jake helped Theresa into the buggy and drove her back to the ranch house, where a concerned Mrs. Winters was waiting. "Donovan's stirring up trouble again," the housekeeper muttered as she poured Theresa a cup of tea. "That man won't be satisfied until he owns half the county." By the time Mrs. Winters had hitched up the wagon to take Theresa back to town, the sun was low on the horizon. Theresa couldn't help feeling disappointed by the abrupt end to what had been a lovely afternoon, and by the interruption of what had felt like an important moment between her and Russell. As she prepared for her first day of school that evening, arranging her desk and reviewing her lessons one final time, Theresa found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the tall rancher with the kind blue eyes. She tried to focus on the task ahead, 20 young minds depending on her guidance, but the memory of Russell's words on the hillside kept returning. "Some of us still value honesty and honor above all else." It wasn't a declaration of feelings exactly, but it felt like a beginning, a careful opening of a door that might lead to something more meaningful than either of them had anticipated when he first lifted her chin at the depot and told her she was worth more than the cruelty she had endured. The first weeks of school passed in a whirlwind of activity. Theresa quickly came to know each of her 23 students, from 6-year-old Tommy Peterson, who struggled with his letters but could already calculate sums in his head faster than she could write them down, to 16-year-old Sarah Jenkins, whose essays showed remarkable insight despite her limited formal education. The classroom was often chaotic, but always lively. Theresa introduced new teaching methods she had learned in Boston, grouping students by ability rather than age for certain subjects, and incorporating hands-on learning whenever possible. She started a small library corner with the books from the Circle G Ranch and encouraged parents to contribute any reading materials they could spare. Word of her innovative approach spread quickly through Las Cruces. Mayor Hollister stopped by one afternoon to observe her teaching and left beaming with approval. "Best decision the town council ever made hiring you," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. Even some of the women who had initially whispered about her began to warm as their children came home enthusiastic about school. Mrs. Grayson, whose twins had previously refused to attend altogether, brought Theresa a freshly baked apple cake in gratitude after both boys completed their first full week without incident. Throughout these busy days, Theresa saw little of Russell Garrett. He came into town occasionally on ranch business, but seemed to deliberately avoid the schoolhouse. When they did encounter each other at church or the general store, he was unfailingly polite, but more reserved than he had been during her stay at the ranch. "Men can be strange creatures, Mrs. Winters commented when Theresa joined the Circle G household for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after school began. Especially ones who aren't used to sorting through their feelings. Theresa had blushed at the housekeeper's knowing look but said nothing. She wasn't sure herself what she felt for Russell, only that his absence left an unexpected emptiness in her days. That particular Sunday, Russell had been called away to help a neighboring ranch with a difficult calving, so Theresa missed seeing him altogether. She tried not to show her disappointment as Jake drove her back to town that evening. "Boss has been working dawn to dusk lately," the ranch hand offered, seemingly sensing her thoughts. "That business with Donovan got resolved, but it put us behind on the fall preparations. Winter comes early in these mountains." Theresa nodded her understanding, though she couldn't help wondering if there was more to Russell's distance than just work demands. The next Friday afternoon, as Theresa was dismissing her students for the weekend, an unexpected visitor appeared at the schoolhouse door. Victor Donovan stood watching as the children filed past him, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as distinctly out of place in the simple classroom. "Miss Adams," he said smoothly once they were alone, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Theresa straightened the desks as she replied, keeping her tone professionally neutral. "School has just ended for the day, Mr. Donovan. What can I do for you?" He moved further into the room, examining the books and materials with a critical eye. "I've been hearing quite a lot about our new school teacher. It seems you've made quite an impression in your short time here." There was something in his tone that put Theresa on guard. "I'm simply doing the job I was hired to do." "Yes, well, about that." Donovan leaned against her desk, too close for comfort. "Some of us on the town council have concerns about your qualifications and background." Theresa stiffened. "My credentials were reviewed and approved by Mayor Hollister." "Hollister isn't the only voice on the council," Donovan countered smoothly. "And there are questions about the circumstances that brought you to Las Cruces. A woman abandoned by her intended husband might be considered of questionable character. Hardly appropriate as an influence on impressionable young minds." The insult was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Theresa felt anger rise within her, but she kept her voice steady. "I was the victim of a cruel deception, Mr. Donovan. I fail to see how that reflects on my character or my ability to teach." Donovan smiled coldly. "Perception matters in small communities, Miss Adams. However, I'm not unreasonable. Perhaps we could discuss your situation over dinner tomorrow evening. I have considerable influence on the council. My support could ensure your continued employment." The implication was clear, and it turned Theresa's stomach. Before she could formulate a suitably scathing response, a deep voice spoke from the doorway. "Miss Adams has other plans tomorrow evening." Russell stood there, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Donovan straightened, his smile becoming a sneer. "Garrett, how convenient that you should appear just now. One might think you've been keeping a close watch on the schoolteacher." Russell entered the room fully, his presence somehow making the small space feel even smaller. "I came to speak with Miss Adams about tutoring one of my ranch hand's children. Finding you here attempting to intimidate her is an unfortunate coincidence for you." Donovan's face flushed with anger. "I was simply expressing legitimate concerns about the school board's hasty hiring decision." "No," Russell said flatly. "You were attempting to use your position to coerce a lady into an inappropriate arrangement. It's not the first time you've tried such tactics, but it will be the last time you direct them at Miss Adams." The tension between the two men was palpable. Theresa stepped forward, unwilling to be a passive participant in her own defense. "Mr. Donovan was just leaving," she said firmly. "And for the record, I have no interest in any arrangement with him, professional or otherwise. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he looked from Theresa to Russell and back again. I see how things stand. Very well. He moved toward the door but paused beside Russell. You've made an enemy today, Garrett. I don't forget such things. Neither do I, Russell replied evenly. After Donovan had gone, Theresa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you for your timely arrival, though I was handling the situation. Russell's expression softened. I have no doubt you were. You're more than capable of putting a man like Donovan in his place. He hesitated. But I couldn't stand by and listen to him speak to you that way. There was such genuine protectiveness in his voice that Theresa felt a warmth spread through her chest. What brings you to the schoolhouse? She asked, changing the subject. Was that story about tutoring just for Donovan's benefit? Russell shook his head. No, that part was true. Charlie's nephew Lewis is struggling with his reading. Charlie mentioned you might be willing to provide extra help after school hours. I'd pay for your time, of course. I'd be happy to help Lewis, Theresa said immediately. But payment isn't necessary. Charlie and all your men were kind to me when I needed kindness most. Russell studied her for a moment, a hint of a smile touching his lips. You're an unusual woman, Theresa Adams. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the quiet schoolhouse, late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Russell seemed to realize it too, for he cleared his throat and took a step back. Actually, there was something else I wanted to ask you. He looked uncharacteristically uncertain. The harvest dance is next weekend. It's a tradition here, marks the end of the growing season before winter sets in. I wondered if you might allow me to escort you. Theresa felt her heart beat faster at the formal invitation. I would like that very much. The smile that spread across Russell's face transformed his usually serious features. Good, that's good. He reached for his hat, which he had placed on a nearby desk. I should let you finish your work. Would Saturday at 7 be acceptable? For the dance, perfect, Theresa confirmed. Unable to keep the smile from her own face at the door, Russell paused once more. Theresa, about Donovan, be careful. He's not a man who takes rejection well, especially public rejection. Theresa nodded, sobering at the warning. I will be, but I won't let him intimidate me either. I'd expect nothing less, Russell replied, and there was unmistakable admiration in his voice. Good evening, Miss Adams. Good evening, Mr. Garrett. As she watched him walk away, Theresa felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with concern about Victor Donovan, and everything to do with the prospect of attending the harvest dance with Russell Garrett. The week leading up to the harvest dance was filled with excited whispers among Theresa's students. The annual event was clearly a highlight of Las Cruces' social calendar, a time when ranchers, farmers, and townspeople came together to celebrate before the isolation of winter set in. Miss Adams, are you going to the dance? Little Mary Wilson asked during Friday's lunch break. Before Theresa could answer, 12-year-old Billy Thompson interjected. Course she is. My ma says Mr. Garrett from Circle G Ranch is escorting her. Says it's the talk of the town. Theresa felt her cheeks warm. Your mother is correct that Mr. Garrett has kindly offered to escort me, she said, trying to sound matter-of-fact. Now back to your arithmetic, please. By Saturday evening, Theresa's nerves were in full flutter. She had spent the afternoon washing her hair and pressing her best dress, a deep blue gown with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't the height of Boston fashion, but it was well made and flattering. As she pinned her hair into a softer style than her usual practical arrangement, Theresa found herself wondering what Russell would think. It was a girlish thought, one she might have had at 16 rather than 22, but she couldn't quite suppress it. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock came at her door. Russell stood on her small porch, freshly shaven and dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, a dark suit, crisp white shirt, and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, though one stubborn curl fell across his forehead in a way Theresa found unexpectedly endearing. "Good evening," he said, his voice a touch deeper than usual. "You look beautiful." The simple compliment, delivered with such evident sincerity, made Theresa's heart skip. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." Russell offered his arm, and they walked together toward the town hall, where the dance was being held. The streets of Las Cruces were alive with activity, other couples and families making their way to the same destination. The hall had been transformed with lanterns, autumn leaves, and bundles of dried corn stalks. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. Nearly everyone in town seemed to be present, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. Mayor Hollister spotted them immediately and hurried over, pumping Russell's hand enthusiastically. "Garrett, good to see you, good to see you. And Miss Adams, our wonderful teacher." He winked broadly at Russell. "You've chosen the most popular lady in town as your companion this evening. Half the school board can't stop singing her praises." Russell's hand came to rest lightly on the small of Theresa's back. "I'm not surprised," he said, with a warm glance in her direction. More introductions followed as townspeople Theresa hadn't yet met came to welcome her. She noticed several curious glances at her and Russell together, but most seemed approving rather than judgmental. When the band struck up a waltz, Russell turned to her. "Would you care to dance?" Theresa nodded, suddenly shy. "I should warn you, it's been some time since I've waltzed." "Fortunately, it's like riding," he said with a hint of a smile. "Once learned, never forgotten." His large hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her onto the dance floor. Theresa had expected him to be a competent if somewhat rustic dancer, but Russell moved with surprising grace for such a tall man. His steps were confident without being showy, and he held her at a respectful distance while still close enough for comfortable conversation. "You're quite good at this," Theresa observed as they moved smoothly around the floor. Russell's eyes crinkled at the corners. "My mother insisted I learn properly. Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a bull in a china shop." Theresa laughed, relaxing into his lead. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he agreed, a touch of sadness coloring his voice briefly before he continued more lightly, "though I complained bitterly about the lessons at 14. They danced twice more before taking a break for refreshments. Mrs. Peterson from the general store waved them over to a table where she sat with her husband and several other couples. The conversation flowed easily, talk of the unusually warm fall, predictions for winter, news of babies born and weddings planned. Theresa found herself thoroughly enjoying the simple pleasure of community celebration. In Boston, she had attended more elegant affairs, certainly, but there was something deeply appealing about the unpretentious warmth of this gathering. Russell stayed attentively by her side throughout the evening, getting her punch, introducing her to people she hadn't yet met, and claiming her for most of the dances. When he did step away briefly to speak with a fellow rancher, Theresa found herself immediately surrounded by several of the town's matrons. "You've certainly caught the eye of one of our most eligible bachelors," Mrs. Hollister, the mayor's wife, said with an approving nod toward Russell. "Russell Garrett is a good man," added Mrs. Peterson. "His father was the same salt of the earth, not the richest rancher in the county, but honest as the day is long." Theresa felt herself blushing. "We're just friends. Mr. Garrett was kind enough to help me when I arrived under difficult circumstances." The women exchanged knowing glances. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Hollister said, patting her hand. "But a man doesn't look at a friend the way he looks at you." Before Theresa could respond to this startling observation, the band began playing a lively square dance. Russell returned to claim her, and soon they were laughing as they whirled through the complicated steps with the other dancers. As the evening progressed, Theresa became aware of Victor Donovan watching them from across the room. He stood with a small group of the town's wealthier citizens, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand and a sour expression on his face. "Don't mind him," Russell murmured, following her gaze. "He's always been a poor loser." The last dance of the evening was a slow waltz. Russell held her a little closer than before, their previous dances having established a comfortable familiarity between them. In the warm glow of the lanterns, with the music swelling around them, Theresa felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Thank you for asking me to come tonight," she said softly. Russell's blue eyes met hers, serious yet warm. "Thank you for accepting. I've been wanting to ask you for weeks." "Why didn't you?" He looked momentarily embarrassed. "I wasn't sure if it was too soon after everything. And then I was busy with the ranch and you were busy with the school." He trailed off, then admitted more honestly, "I suppose I was nervous you might say no." The confession from this strong, capable man touched Theresa deeply. "I wouldn't have said no," she told him, holding his gaze. Something shifted in Russell's expression, a softening, a certainty. As the music came to an end, he didn't immediately release her hand. "May I walk you home?" The night air was cool as they left the town hall, a reminder that winter was indeed approaching. Russell removed his jacket and placed it around Theresa's shoulders despite her protests. "My mother would rise from her grave to scold me if I let a lady catch cold," he said firmly. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager to end the evening. When they reached Theresa's small house, Russell escorted her to the door. "I had a wonderful time," Theresa said, slipping off his jacket and returning it to him. Russell nodded, suddenly looking uncertain again. "As did I." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you consider riding out to the ranch tomorrow after church? Mrs. Winters is making a special dinner, and she specifically asked me to invite you." "I would like that very much," Theresa replied. There was a moment of charged silence between them. Russell took a half-step closer, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. Theresa held her breath, certain he was about to kiss her and equally certain that she wanted him to. Instead, he gently took her hand and raised it to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that somehow felt more intimate than a kiss might have been. "Good night, Theresa," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night, Russell," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness, before finally entering her house. As she prepared for bed, Theresa realized that something fundamental had changed that evening. What had begun as gratitude and friendship was blossoming into something deeper, something that both thrilled and frightened her with its potential. She had come to New Mexico to marry a man she knew only through letters. Now she was falling in love with a man she was coming to know through actions and words that revealed his true character, a character as solid and dependable as the mountains that watched over Las Cruces. The weeks that followed the harvest dance saw a deepening of the relationship between Theresa and Russell. He began to visit the schoolhouse regularly, often arriving just as she dismissed her students for the day. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, honey from a neighbor's hives, or wildflowers gathered on his rides across the ranch. They established a comfortable routine. Sundays after church were spent at Circle G Ranch with Mrs. Winters and the ranch hands. Some weekday evenings, Russell would join Theresa for simple suppers at her small house, bringing steaks or game from the ranch while she prepared vegetables and biscuits. They talked for hours about everything and nothing: their childhoods, their dreams, the daily happenings of school and ranch life. October turned to November, and the weather grew colder. The mountains received their first dusting of snow, and morning frosts became common. Theresa began preparing her students for their Christmas recital, a tradition the town looked forward to each year. One particularly cold Saturday in late November, Russell arrived at Theresa's door with an unexpected proposition. "I need to ride up to the north pasture to check on some cattle before the next storm hits," he explained. "I thought you might like to come along. The view from up there is spectacular, especially after a fresh snow." Theresa hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm dressed for such an outing." She was wearing a simple wool dress with a shawl hardly suitable for a winter ride into the mountains. Russell smiled. "I thought of that. Mrs. Winters sent these along." He held up a bundle that proved to contain a heavy coat, gloves, and a woolen scarf. "They belonged to my mother, but Mrs. Winters keeps them in good repair. She thought they might fit you." Touched by the gesture, Theresa accepted the warm clothes. They fit remarkably well, perhaps slightly loose in the shoulders, but otherwise comfortable. Once properly bundled up, she joined Russell in his wagon for the journey to Circle G Ranch, where they would exchange it for horses. "Are you sure I can manage a horse?" Theresa asked as they approached the ranch. "It's been many years since I rode regularly." "I've got just the mount for you," Russell assured her. "Daisy is gentle as a lamb but sure-footed in rough country, and we'll take it slow. At the ranch, Mrs. Winters insisted they have hot coffee and fresh biscuits before setting out. "The mountains are no place to go on an empty stomach," she declared, eyeing Theresa critically. "You're too thin as it is. Teaching 20 children must burn energy like a furnace burns coal." Once properly fed and warmed, they headed to the barn, where Russell had already saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy stallion and a smaller dappled mare that regarded Theresa with calm brown eyes. "This is Daisy," Russell introduced them. "She's carried Mrs. Winters safely for years, so she knows how to behave with a lady." Theresa approached the horse carefully, offering her hand for the animal to sniff. Daisy nudged it gently, and Theresa smiled, already feeling comfortable with the docile creature. Russell helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her to the saddle. He adjusted her stirrups and showed her how to hold the reins properly before mounting his own horse. "We'll stay at a walk until you're comfortable," he promised. "Just let her follow my horse. She knows the trails better than most humans." The first part of their journey took them across the lower pastures of Circle G Ranch, where cattle grazed on the remaining fall grass. As they rode, Russell pointed out landmarks and boundaries, sharing stories about how his father had built the ranch piece by piece over the years. "He started with just 50 acres and a dozen cattle," Russell explained. "By the time he died, we had over 2,000 acres and 300 head. Not the biggest spread in the county by any means, but respectable." "You've added to it since then," Theresa observed, remembering what Mrs. Winters had told her. Russell nodded. "Another 500 acres. The Barton place to the east came up for sale when old man Barton died with no heirs. It has good water rights. That's what Donovan really wants. Control of the water in this valley would give him control of everything else." As they began to climb into the foothills, the landscape changed. Pine and juniper trees appeared, their green branches standing out starkly against the patches of snow. The air grew colder and clearer, each breath visible in small clouds. True to his word, Russell set an easy pace, frequently checking to ensure Theresa was comfortable. To her surprise, she found herself enjoying the ride immensely. Her body remembered the rhythm of horseback riding better than she had expected, and Daisy was indeed a perfect mount for a novice rider, responsive, but not flighty. They reached the north pasture around midday. It was a high meadow nestled between two ridges, currently empty of cattle, but showing signs of their recent presence. Russell dismounted and helped Theresa down, then tethered both horses to a small stand of trees. "The herd should be just over that rise," he explained, pointing to a gentle slope to their right. "I need to make sure they've moved down to the lower shelters before the big storm hits." They walked together across the meadow, their boots crunching in the shallow snow. Russell moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew every inch of his land, while Theresa found herself captivated by the wild beauty surrounding them. "It's breathtaking," she said softly, turning in a slow circle to take in the panoramic view of mountains and valleys spreading out below them. Russell watched her, a smile touching his lips. "Yes, it is." When she turned to face him, Theresa realized he wasn't looking at the landscape at all. The intensity in his blue eyes made her heart race, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Theresa," Russell finally said, his voice deeper than usual, "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, however, a low rumble sounded in the distance. Russell's expression immediately shifted from tender to concerned as he looked toward the western sky. "That's not good," he muttered, his experienced eye assessing the dark clouds gathering with alarming speed over the mountains. "The storm's coming in faster than I expected." Theresa followed his gaze, suddenly noticing how the previously clear sky was rapidly disappearing behind ominous gray clouds. The wind had picked up as well, carrying a bite of ice that hadn't been there minutes before. "We need to get back to the ranch," Russell said decisively, taking her elbow and guiding her back toward the horses. "Mountain storms can turn dangerous quickly, especially this time of year." They mounted swiftly, Russell no longer taking time for niceties, but ensuring Theresa was securely in the saddle before swinging up onto his own horse. As they set off down the trail, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, swirling around them in the strengthening wind. "Stay close," Russell instructed, his voice raised to carry over the rising whistle of the wind. "If the snow gets heavy, visibility can drop to nothing in minutes." Theresa nodded, her gloved hands tight on the reins as she urged Daisy to follow Russell's mount. The gentle mare seemed to sense the urgency, picking up her pace without becoming skittish. The storm intensified with frightening speed. What had been a few scattered snowflakes quickly became a heavy curtain of white, driven sideways by the howling wind. The temperature plummeted, and Theresa found herself grateful for the warm coat Mrs. Winters had provided. As the visibility decreased, Russell slowed their pace, clearly concerned about the horses losing the trail. He kept looking back at Theresa, his face etched with worry beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. "We're still a good hour from the ranch at this pace," he called back to her after consulting his pocket watch. "And the storm's getting worse." Theresa tried to appear calmer than she felt. "What should we do?" Russell scanned the area, though there wasn't much to see through the swirling snow. "There's an old line cabin about a quarter-mile east of here. We used it during roundups before we built the bunkhouse. It's basic, but it has a stove and 4 walls. We'll shelter there until the worst passes." He guided them off the main trail and through a stand of pines that provided some relief from the driving snow. Theresa could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but she trusted Russell's knowledge of his land and Daisy's sure-footed instincts. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, a dark shape materialized through the white haze, a small, sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping that provided some natural shelter from the wind. Russell dismounted quickly and helped Theresa down, her legs stiff from cold and tension. He led both horses to a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, where they would have some protection from the elements. "Get inside," he urged, pressing a key into her hand. "I'll take care of the horses and be right in." The cabin door creaked open to reveal a single room with sparse but functional furnishings: a small iron stove in one corner, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot along one wall, and shelves containing basic supplies. It was cold and dusty but wonderfully solid after the chaotic storm outside. Theresa immediately set to work, finding matches and kindling by the stove. By the time Russell entered, stamping snow from his boots, she had a small fire started. "The horses are settled," he reported, removing his hat and coat and hanging them on pegs by the door. "I gave them some feed from the stores here. They'll be fine until the storm passes." He crossed to the stove, holding his hands out to the growing warmth. "You're handy with a fire," he observed with approval. "My father believed every person should know basic survival skills," Theresa explained, adding another stick of wood carefully. "He taught me to build fires, fish, even shoot a rifle, much to my mother's dismay." Russell smiled at that. "A wise man, your father." He moved to the shelves, taking inventory of the supplies. "We're in luck. There's coffee, beans, flour, and even some salt pork, and enough firewood to keep us warm until tomorrow if necessary." The implication that they might be stranded overnight hung in the air between them. Theresa felt a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "Will anyone worry about us?" she asked, removing her gloves and warming her hands by the fire. Russell shook his head. "Mrs. Winters knows we went to check the north pasture. She'll assume we took shelter when the storm hit, and no one in Las Cruces would expect you back in this weather." As the cabin slowly warmed, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Russell set a pot of coffee to boil on the stove while Theresa found tin plates and cups in a small cabinet. Together, they prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, with biscuits Russell somehow managed to bake in a small cast iron skillet. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Garrett," Theresa teased as he presented her with a perfectly brown biscuit. "I wouldn't have taken you for a baker." "Another of my mother's lessons," he replied with a grin. "She said a man who can feed himself is never truly helpless." They ate at the small table, the howling of the wind outside making their shelter seem all the more secure and intimate. The single room had warmed considerably, allowing them to remove their heavier outer layers. As they sipped their coffee after the meal, the conversation turned more personal. "You never finished telling me what you wanted to say up on the ridge," Theresa ventured, watching Russell's face in the warm glow of the oil lamp they had lit as darkness fell. He met her gaze steadily, his blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. "No, I didn't." Setting his cup aside, Russell reached across the table and took her hand in his. "Theresa, when you first arrived in Las Cruces, I wanted to help you because it was the right thing to do. I couldn't stand by and watch someone be humiliated and abandoned that way." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "But over these past months, my feelings have changed, deepened. You're not just someone who needed help anymore. You're—" He struggled for words, then said simply, "You're the first person I want to tell when something good happens. You're the one I think about when I see something beautiful on the ranch. Your smile makes even the hardest day feel worthwhile." Theresa felt tears prick her eyes at the honest emotion in his voice. "Russell, I'm not a man of fancy words," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "But I want you to know that I care for you deeply, Theresa Adams, more than I've ever cared for anyone, and if you might feel the same way." He hesitated, then finished, I'd like to court you properly with honorable intentions." The formal request, so characteristic of this honorable man, touched Theresa's heart. "I do feel the same way," she said softly. "I've been falling in love with you a little more each day since you lifted my chin at that depot and told me I was worth more." Russell's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and drew her gently to her feet and into his arms. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. At her nod, he lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Theresa moved closer, lifting her face to his. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared emotion. His arms tightened around her waist as hers circled his neck, and for a long moment, the howling storm outside ceased to exist. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the harvest dance," he admitted. Theresa smiled up at him. "Why did you wait so long?" "I wanted to be sure you were ready," he said simply. "After what Gardner did, I didn't want to rush you or make you feel pressured in any way." The consideration behind his words only increased Theresa's certainty about her feelings. This man, who thought so carefully about her comfort and well-being, was everything Leonard Gardner had pretended to be and more. As the evening progressed, they talked by the warmth of the stove, sharing more of their hopes and dreams. Russell spoke of his plans for the ranch, the improvements he wanted to make, the legacy he hoped to build. Theresa told him of her love for teaching and her desire to make a difference in her students' lives. When exhaustion finally overtook them, they faced the awkward reality of their situation. One small cabin, one narrow cot, and a proper upbringing that made sharing it unthinkable. "You take the cot," Russell insisted. "I'll be fine on the floor near the stove." Theresa wanted to protest, but knew he wouldn't relent. Instead, she helped him make a pallet with spare blankets found in a trunk, making it as comfortable as possible. As they settled for the night, Theresa on the cot and Russell on his makeshift bed, she found herself thinking how strange life could be. She had traveled to New Mexico to marry a man she knew only through letters, only to be humiliated and abandoned. Yet that very abandonment had led her to Russell Garrett and a deeper, truer love than she could have imagined. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, Theresa Adams had found an unexpected shelter for her heart. Morning brought a transformed world. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched white snow glittering in the early sunlight. Theresa woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Russell stoking the fire in the small stove. "Good morning," he said, smiling when he noticed her watching him. "Sleep well?" Theresa sat up, smoothing her rumpled dress. "Better than I would have expected on such a narrow cot." "I've slept on worse," he replied cheerfully, pouring her a cup of coffee and bringing it to her. "The storm's passed, but there's a good foot of snow out there. We should head back once you've had breakfast. Mrs. Winters will be worried, though I imagine she knows exactly where we are." There was something different about him this morning, a lightness, a quiet joy that made his blue eyes seem even brighter. Theresa felt it too, this new understanding between them that had transformed everything. After a simple breakfast of the remaining biscuits, they bundled up in their now dry outer clothing and prepared to leave. Russell checked on the horses, which had weathered the storm comfortably in their sheltered lean-to. As Theresa waited by the door, Russell paused beside her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture of casual intimacy that made her heart beat faster. "I meant everything I said last night," he told her quietly. "I want to court you properly, Theresa. No rushing, no pressure." She smiled up at him. I meant everything I said too, and proper courting sounds perfect. He kissed her then, a gentle, lingering kiss that promised many more to come. When they parted, he rested his hand at the small of her back as they stepped out into the brilliant winter morning together. The ride back to Circle G Ranch took longer than usual due to the snow, but Theresa hardly noticed the time passing. The world around them was breathtakingly beautiful trees draped in white, the mountains sharp and clear against the blue sky, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. They arrived at the ranch just before noon to find Mrs. Winters watching anxiously from the porch. The housekeeper's worried expression quickly changed to one of knowing satisfaction as she observed them riding in side by side, their faces alight with shared happiness. "Got caught in the storm, did you?" she asked, trying to sound stern but failing to hide her pleasure at seeing them together. "I figured as much when you didn't return yesterday. Good thing you had the sense to shelter at the line cabin." Russell helped Theresa dismount, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. "We did indeed, Mrs. Winters, and now we're half frozen and starving." "Well, come inside then," the housekeeper huffed, ushering them toward the house. "I've got stew simmering and fresh bread just out of the oven, though I suspect you two would hardly notice if I served you cold beans the way you're looking at each other." Theresa blushed, but didn't contradict her. It was true something fundamental had shifted between her and Russell, and she had no desire to hide it. News of their relationship spread quickly through Las Cruces, as news tended to do in small communities. Most reactions were positive. Mayor Hollister beamed approvingly when he saw them walking arm in arm after church. Mrs. Peterson remarked loudly that it was about time Russell Garrett found himself a worthy woman. Even Theresa's students seemed pleased, especially those whose parents ranched near Circle G. Of course, not everyone was supportive. Victor Donovan made a point of spreading rumors about their improper overnight stay during the snowstorm. But these attempts at scandal-mongering gained little traction in a community that had already embraced Theresa as their teacher and had long respected Russell as a rancher of integrity. The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with joy for Theresa. During the day, she prepared her students for their holiday recital, teaching them carols and helping them memorize poems and dialogues to perform for their parents. In the evenings, Russell often visited her small house, sometimes bringing Mrs. Winters along as a proper chaperone, sometimes accompanied by Jake or Charlie, who would discreetly occupy themselves elsewhere to give them some privacy while maintaining propriety. On the last day of school before the Christmas break, Theresa's students presented their recital to a packed audience of parents and townspeople. The children performed admirably. Even shy Tommy Peterson recited his poem without a single stumble, and the older students' rendition of scenes from A Christmas Carol brought both laughter and a few tears. Afterward, as parents congratulated their children and thanked Theresa for her efforts, Mayor Hollister approached with an official-looking envelope. "Miss Adams, the school board met yesterday," he announced, handing her the envelope. "We unanimously voted to offer you a permanent position as Las Cruces school teacher with a modest increase in salary starting next term." Theresa's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. "Thank you, Mayor. I'm honored by your confidence." "It's well earned," he assured her. "You've done wonders with our children in just a few months. We consider ourselves fortunate to have found you however unconventional your arrival might have been." As the crowd dispersed, Russell made his way to her side, his expression warm with pride. "Congratulations," he said. "Though I'm not surprised. You've won over every child in this town and most of the parents, too." "Not quite everyone," Theresa said, nodding discreetly toward Victor Donovan, who stood near the door with a sour expression. He was the only school board member who voted against my appointment, according to Mrs. Hollister. Russell's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice light. Donovan wouldn't recognize quality teaching if it recited Shakespeare while standing on his expensive boots. He offered her his arm. "May I escort you home? I believe Mrs. Winters has prepared a special celebration dinner for us at the ranch." Christmas at Circle G Ranch was a revelation for Theresa. Used to quiet, modest holidays in Boston after her parents' deaths, she was unprepared for the festive atmosphere Russell and Mrs. Winters created. The ranch house was decorated with pine boughs, red ribbons, and candles. A tall pine tree stood in the corner of the main room, adorned with simple ornaments some store-bought, others clearly handmade over the years. All the ranch hands joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing small gifts and hearty appetites. Mrs. Winters outdid herself with the meal: a roast turkey, ham, multiple vegetables, 3 kinds of pie, and her special plum pudding that she claimed was made from a recipe brought west by Russell's mother. After the meal, they exchanged gifts around the fire. Theresa had spent weeks secretly working on presents for everyone: knitted scarves for the ranch hands, a fine shawl for Mrs. Winters, and for Russell, a leather-bound journal with his initials tooled into the cover. "For your ranch records," she explained as he ran his fingers over the supple leather. "You mentioned that your father always kept detailed journals, but that you've been making do with loose papers." Russell looked genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of her gift. "It's perfect," he said softly. "Thank you." When it came time for his gift to her, Russell seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Inside was a velvet box, and within it, a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When Theresa opened it, she found a tiny photograph of her parents that she had kept in a frame beside her bed somehow. Russell had borrowed it long enough to have a miniature version made for the locket. "So you can keep them close to your heart," he explained, watching her face anxiously. "Mrs. Winters helped me get the photograph while you were at school one day. I hope you don't mind." Tears filled Theresa's eyes as she looked from the locket to Russell's face. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received," she whispered. "Thank you." He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. And Theresa knew she would treasure it always, not just for the images it contained, but for the love behind the giving. New Year's Eve brought another celebration, this time a community dance at the town hall. As midnight approached, Russell led Theresa outside, away from the crowded hall to a small garden where they could see the stars clearly in the cold winter sky. "I wanted a moment alone with you before the year ends," he explained, taking both her hands in his. "This has been a remarkable year, one that brought unexpected changes for both of us." Theresa nodded, thinking of how different her life was now from what she had imagined when she first boarded the train to New Mexico. "Indeed it has." Russell's expression grew serious as he continued. "I know we agreed to court properly with no rushing, but these past weeks have only confirmed what I already knew in my heart." He took a deep breath, then said, "I love you, Theresa Adams. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love watching you with your students and seeing how you've made a place for yourself in this community." Theresa felt her heart swell with emotion. "I love you too, Russell, more than I thought possible." Inside the hall, they could hear the countdown to midnight beginning. Russell smiled and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small box. "I had planned to wait longer," he said softly, "but I find I don't want to begin a new year without asking you this question." He went down on one knee before her, opening the box to reveal a modest but beautiful ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires on a silver band. "Theresa Adams, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need a husband or I need a wife, but because I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, facing whatever comes together." As shouts of "Happy New Year" erupted from inside the hall, Theresa looked down at the man kneeling before her, this good, honorable man who had first seen her worth when she was at her lowest point and had loved her more with each passing day. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears of joy in her eyes. "Yes, Russell Garrett, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger just as the first celebratory fireworks exploded in the sky above Las Cruces. Standing, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, both of them smiling too much for the kiss to be entirely successful. When they returned to the hall, hand in hand with Theresa's ring catching the light, their announcement was met with cheers and congratulations. Even Victor Donovan, after a moment of tight-lipped displeasure, offered a curt nod of acknowledgement before turning away. They were married in the Las Cruces church on a bright spring day in April 1879, just over 6 months after Theresa had first arrived in New Mexico. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around who had come to respect Russell Garrett and the Boston schoolteacher who had so completely won his heart. Theresa wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Winters and several town ladies had helped her make, with her mother's lace veil and the silver locket Russell had given her for Christmas. Russell, looking both nervous and proud in his new suit, waited for her at the altar with Charlie serving as his best man. Mayor Hollister's wife played the organ as Theresa walked down the aisle alone, her head held high. But she wasn't truly alone. The faces that smiled at her from the pews represented the community that had become her family, supporting her journey from abandoned mail order bride to respected teacher and beloved wife-to-be. When the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, one of Theresa's students, 16-year-old Sarah Jenkins, stood up and said clearly, "She gives herself, with the blessing of all who love her." It was an unconventional response that brought murmurs of approval from the congregation and tears to Theresa's eyes. The reception was held at Circle G Ranch, where tables laden with food were set up under a canopy of trees, just beginning to leaf out in the spring warmth. Children ran and played, adults danced to the music of a small local band, and everyone proclaimed it the finest wedding Las Cruces had seen in years. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration continued around them, Russell took Theresa's hand and led her away from the crowd to the small rise overlooking the stream, his favorite spot on the ranch, where they had almost shared their first meaningful conversation before being interrupted by Donovan's men. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they gazed out over the land that was now theirs together. Theresa leaned into his embrace, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "And you, Mr. Garrett? Any regrets about marrying a stranded Easterner who couldn't even recognize a decent man when she first met him?" Russell laughed, turning her to face him. "If you're referring to the fact that you looked at me with considerable suspicion when I first offered you shelter, I consider that evidence of your good sense rather than a failing." His expression grew serious as he added, "And no, not a single regret. Only gratitude for whatever twist of fate brought you to Las Cruces, even if it was Gardner's cruelty." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise for their future together. When they parted, Theresa looked up at the man who had first seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself and knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in a person. "We should return to our guests," she said reluctantly. Russell nodded, though he made no move to release her. "In a moment. I just want to remember this, you and me, at the beginning of our life together." As they stood together on the hillside, the late afternoon sun gilding the land around them, Theresa thought about the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. The pain of Leonard Gardner's betrayal had faded to a distant memory, overshadowed by the joy she had found in her new life, a life that included teaching children she had come to love, living in a community that valued her contributions, and sharing her days with a man whose quiet strength and unwavering honor had healed wounds she hadn't realized she carried. When they finally returned to the celebration, it was hand in hand, their faces alight with the kind of happiness that comes not from perfect circumstances, but from finding the perfect partner with whom to face life's imperfections. And if anyone at the wedding remembered the humiliated young woman who had stood alone and weeping at the Las Cruces depot just 7 months earlier, they saw in her transformation a testament to both her own resilience and the power of being truly seen and valued by someone who recognized her worth. Epilogue. 5 years later, the schoolhouse door burst open as children spilled out into the bright June sunshine, their excited voices filling the air as they celebrated the last day of the school year. Theresa Garrett stood in the doorway watching them go, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other waving goodbye to her students. "Have a wonderful summer," she called after them. "And don't forget your reading assignments," a few groans mixed with the cheerful farewells, making her smile. 5 years of teaching in Las Cruces had taught her that such reminders were necessary if she wanted her students to return in the fall having retained anything from the previous year. As the last child disappeared down the dusty street, Theresa turned back into the now quiet classroom to gather her things. The school had grown considerably since she first arrived, now boasting separate rooms for younger and older students, with Theresa teaching the older group, while a young woman from Santa Fe handled the primary grades. She was carefully placing papers in her satchel when she heard the familiar sound of a wagon approaching. Looking up, she smiled at the sight of her husband bringing their wagon to a stop outside the schoolhouse. Russell looked much the same as he had when they first met, perhaps a few more lines around his eyes, his face a bit more weathered from working outdoors, but his blue eyes still held the same warmth and integrity that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Ready to head home, Mrs. Garrett?" he called, jumping down from the wagon and coming to meet her at the door. "More than ready," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. After 5 years of marriage, such greetings still sent a pleasant warmth through her. Little Russell was especially active today. "I think he's as eager for summer break as his future schoolmates." Russell placed his hand gently on her rounded stomach, his expression softening as he felt the baby kick. "Or little Theresa," he reminded her with a smile. "Though at this rate, he or she will be riding horses before learning to walk, just like their brother." Their firstborn, James, named after Russell's father, was already a precocious 3-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Currently, he was spending the day with Mrs. Winters, who at 72 remained a vital part of their household, though she had gradually ceded most household duties to younger helpers as the ranch prospered. "How were final recitations?" Russell asked as he helped Theresa into the wagon, handling her as carefully as he might a piece of fine china despite her protests that pregnancy didn't make her fragile. "Wonderful," she replied, settling herself comfortably. Sarah Jenkins's younger brother Thomas delivered a perfect rendition of the Gettysburg Address. And little Maria Peterson, who was so shy she wouldn't speak above a whisper when I first came here, performed a scene from Shakespeare that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Russell smiled as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "You've done remarkable things with this school, Theresa. The whole town knows it." It was true. Under Theresa's guidance, the Las Cruces School had become known throughout the territory for its progressive teaching methods and excellent results. Students now came from as far as 20 miles away to attend, and last year, one of Theresa's graduates had been accepted to a college back east, the first from Las Cruces to achieve such recognition. As they drove through town toward Circle G Ranch, Theresa noted the changes 5 years had brought to Las Cruces. The main street now boasted a proper hotel, a bank, 2 competing general stores, and even a small lending library that she had helped establish. The population had nearly doubled, with new families arriving regularly as the railroad expanded further into the territory. "Have you heard any news about the railroad spur?" she asked Russell as they passed the busy construction site where a new territorial government office was being built. Russell nodded. "Mayor Hollister confirmed it yesterday. They'll break ground next month. Should be completed by Christmas if the weather cooperates." He glanced at her with a smile. "Circle G beef will be heading to markets in Denver and Chicago by this time next year." The railroad connection was the culmination of years of work by Russell and other local ranchers. It would transform their operations, allowing them to ship cattle directly to eastern markets without the punishing cattle drives that had been necessary in the past. Circle G Ranch had prospered under Russell's management, growing to over 4,000 acres with substantial herds of both cattle and horses. The modest house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and a new bunkhouse provided comfortable quarters for the dozen men now employed full-time at the ranch. But the physical improvements paled in comparison to the life they had built together. Their marriage had deepened with each passing year, the initial attraction maturing into a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and enduring love. They complemented each other perfectly, Russell's quiet strength balancing Theresa's more outspoken nature, her intellectual curiosity enriching his practical approach to life. As they turned onto the road leading to their ranch, Theresa caught sight of a lone rider coming from the opposite direction. Even at a distance, she recognized Victor Donovan's straight-backed posture and expensive horse. Russell noticed him too, his jaw tightening slightly. Despite the passing years, Donovan remained a thorn in their side, though his power in the community had waned considerably after several failed business ventures and a scandal involving missing cattle that had nearly resulted in criminal charges. The 2 men nodded curtly to each other as they passed on the road, neither speaking. Some enmities, Theresa had learned, never fully disappeared, though Donovan had eventually given up his more active attempts to undermine Russell's standing in the community. "Still can't believe he keeps showing his face around here after that rustling business," Russell muttered once Donovan was well behind them. Theresa patted his arm. "Some men never learn from their mistakes. It's why you've prospered while he's lost half his land." She smiled. "Besides, living well is the best revenge, isn't it?" Russell's expression softened as he looked at her. "You always did have a way of putting things in perspective." They crested the final hill, and Circle G Ranch spread out before them, the whitewashed house with its wide porch, the red barn, corrals filled with horses, pastures where cattle grazed, and in the distance, the majestic Organ Mountains standing sentinel over it all. And running across the yard toward their wagon came a small figure, his dark hair flying behind him and his face split by an enormous smile. "Mama, Papa," James shouted, with Mrs. Winters following at a more sedate pace, her weathered face creased with affection for her young charge. Russell pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down to scoop up his son, tossing him high in the air before setting him on his shoulders. "Were you good for Mrs. Winters today, Cowboy?" he asked, tickling the boy's foot. James giggled. "Yes. We made cookies and fed the chickens, and I didn't even fall in the horse trough this time." Theresa laughed as Russell helped her down from the wagon. "That's certainly an improvement over last week," she said, accepting a slightly sticky kiss from her son as Russell lowered him to greet her. The evening unfolded in the comfortable routine. They had established a family dinner on the porch to catch the cool breeze. Bath time for James with much splashing and laughter. Then stories before bedtime. Russell read, while Theresa sat in the rocking chair he had made for her after James was born, her hands resting on her belly as she felt their second child move within her. After James was finally asleep, they sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Russell's arm was around her shoulders, and Theresa leaned against him, perfectly content in the quiet moment. "I received a letter today," Russell said eventually, his voice thoughtful. "From Boston." Theresa looked up at him in surprise. "Boston? Who do you know in Boston?" "I don't," he replied. "But apparently Leonard Gardner does or did. The letter was from a lawyer there. Gardner died last month. Typhoid fever." Theresa absorbed this unexpected news. It had been years since she had thought of the man whose cruel deception had inadvertently led her to Russell. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said finally, "though I can't pretend he meant anything to me after what he did." Russell nodded, understanding. The lawyer wrote because Gardner apparently had a change of heart at the end. He left a small sum of money. The letter calls it restitution to be paid to you. It's not much, but the lawyer thought you might want to know. "How strange," Theresa murmured. "After all this time." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "We should donate it to the school library. Something good should come from it, at least." Russell kissed the top of her head. "I thought you might say that. I'll write back tomorrow." They fell silent again, content in each other's company as the first stars of evening appeared above the mountains. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and pine from the hills, mingling with the more domestic aromas of home baking bread, saddle leather, the roses Theresa had planted along the porch rails. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Theresa asked eventually. "If Gardner had met me at the depot as promised, if you hadn't been there that day." Russell considered her question seriously, as he did all questions. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our life together at James, at this home we've built, at the good work you do with your students and the legacy we're creating here, and I can only be grateful for how things did unfold." He turned to face her more fully. "Are you happy, Theresa? Truly happy with this life?" She smiled up at him, her heart full. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said truthfully. "I came to New Mexico looking for a husband and found so much more: a partner, a community, meaningful work, a family." She touched his face gently. "I found you, Russell Garrett, and you were worth the journey." He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his blue eyes reflecting the depth of his feeling for her. "And you, Theresa Garrett, were worth waiting for." As darkness settled fully over Circle G Ranch, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their plans for the summer, the new schoolhouse addition that would be built. The cattle drive Russell would lead in August, the baby due to arrive in early September. Simple plans, perhaps, but woven together with love and shared purpose. It was, Theresa reflected as she rested in her husband's arms, a far cry from the desperate, humiliated young woman who had stood alone on the Las Cruces depot platform 5 years earlier. That woman could never have imagined the happiness, that awaited her happiness born not from the fairy tale romance she had foolishly believed in, but from the genuine love of a man who had seen her true worth from the very beginning. And as the first stars of night appeared over the New Mexico mountains, Theresa silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought her to this place, this life, this love, a love that had begun with a simple act of kindness when a tall cowboy had gently lifted her chin and told her she was worth more